Hello, I'm on this new channel, and I've decided I'm just gonna start off with a good entry-level video. This is the top 10 worst bosses of all time. Spoiler warning for the games I'm about to talk about. So, firstly, what do you think of when I say worst bosses of all time? Do you think unbalanced challenge? Do you think mechanics that aren't suited for the game they're a part of? Or do you think awful design decisions that would never work managing to get approved? Well, this boss, or should I say bosses, may just fit all three pieces of criteria. Now, this boss comes from a little game called Deus Ex Human Revolution, a game that makes you use stealth to handle most situations. So obviously, you level up your stealth skills. But none of the bosses are designed for stealth, which is the main flaw of the game. The number 10 spot goes to every boss in Deus Ex Human Revolution, because every single one of them are damage sponges who can throw grenades and use rocket launchers and miniguns, which are more suited for a game like Spec Ops: The Line, where the character you play as is a tank who can also evade well. Although in Deus Ex, evasion is possible, cover is limited in all of these boss fights. So you're almost guaranteed to take a hit, which can be fatal. Which isn't even mentioning how most, if not all of the bosses can throw grenades behind cover, forcing you to exit, meaning you'll take a hit. These are the least crap bosses on the list, and it really shows how awful the next 9 bosses are going to be. It sets the bar very, very low. Now, I was in contention for the next spot. It was between the boss I chose and Hoyt from Far Cry 3. I'll get into the boss I chose in a sec, but I'm going to talk about Hoyt for a little bit. So there's 3 main antagonists in Far Cry 3. You kill the best one halfway through the game, so it just kind of switches its main antagonist to Hoyt. And Hoyt is nowhere near as interesting as Vaas. Do you know how you kill all 3 of the main bosses in Far Cry 3? QuickTime events. You played through an entire game just to fight the final boss, who isn't as interesting as a secondary antagonist, just to kill him in yet another QuickTime event. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Hoyt. The boss we are here to talk about, and the boss that takes a number 9 spot, is a boss from Fable 2, and if you've played Fable 2, you know exactly who I'm talking about. It's the final boss, Lucian. As Lucian is the final boss, you would expect him to be a, boss. But no, he basically monologues to you for a few minutes, and then one of your NPC friends shoot him. And you can also shoot him during the monologue, which kills him instantly. He's been taunting you for the entire game, and that's how it ends. Fable 2 itself isn't really that strong of a game, so this ending definitely put people off, and there are some people saying that, canonically, he shouldn't have been the final boss. I mean, it should have been the final boss, but it shouldn't be counted as the final boss. And in fairness, I can kind of see why. Huge spoiler warning for the next game. The next game we're going to talk about is the final game in a trilogy, and it's the final boss fight. I mean, quote-unquote boss fight from that trilogy. It's Mass Effect. So, Mass Effect, all 3 games are building up to you having the final fight with the Geth. You know, the leader of the Geth. You've gone through hundreds of hours of gameplay, met so many people, watched so many of them die just for this point. And what they do is they fire a laser at you, injuring you. So you're no longer physically able to fight. So the number 8 spot on this list technically doesn't count, because there is no boss at the end of Mass Effect 3. But as you're injured, you start walking forward. You see some enemies, you shoot them, obviously, because they're enemies. And then, out from behind the crates, you see it. The final boss in the entire Mass Effect franchise. Marauder Shields! Ah yes, Marauder Shields. It must have been you. You must be the leader behind everything. Let's get... Oh, he's dead. Really? This is how Mass Effect 3 ends. This is why no one liked the ending of Mass Effect 3. Because you don't actually get to fight the boss. It wasn't even like one of those boss fights where you win, but not really. You know, where you win the fight and then a cutscene shows the bad guy just running off or something. They couldn't even do that. Okay. Whatever you say, Mass Effect, whatever you say. No fancy intro for this one, it doesn't deserve it. Number 7 is the Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1. I promise you this is going to be the only Dark Souls boss, and if you're at all familiar with the series, you know why. In a game heralded for its melee combat, they decided to emphasize platforming. Which in itself doesn't sound like an awful concept, but the jumping mechanic in Dark Souls is probably the worst jumping mechanic in any game ever. The jumps in Dark Souls are short bunny hops which require a sprint starter. Now, the gaps in the floor for the Bed of Chaos boss fight are quite large, so you need to time the jump. So you jump right at the very end of the platform, which is really hard to do because you're sprinting, which means it's really easy to fall in, and if you jump too early, because the jump is so short, you won't make it across. And even if you can consistently make the jump over and over again, it doesn't really matter because of the way the ground suddenly falls down from underneath you. You wouldn't be blamed for falling in the holes just anyway. You basically kill a shackle, run to the middle, or should I say avoid the falling platforms, and then jump across a stupid bridge thing and then kill a bug that dies in a single hit. It's not fun at all. The only reason this boss doesn't rank above other bosses is purely just because when you break one shackle, that doesn't come back. Once you break that shackle, you don't have to break it again. The only issue with that is when I say you don't have to do something, that means that thing isn't very fun to do. I would actually say it's easier to break a shackle, die, and then run to the middle and kill the bug. Yes, this boss is better if you die halfway through. Right, I'm done talking about this boss, let's just go to the next one. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't fought most of the bosses on the list myself. I just know they're really bad, but this boss, I actually have. This boss is Deathstroke from Arkham Knight. Now, if you've played Arkham Knight, you know why. Basically, as soon as you finish the main storyline for Batman Arkham Knight, Deathstroke starts taunting you throughout the entire rest of the game while you do all of the side missions. And it all builds up to this massive boss fight with Deathstroke. And you're like, oh yes, this is going to be so good. I'm going to put hundreds of hours into this. I just want to have that Deathstroke boss fight. And then finally, after you do all of the missions, go through all of that time just to fight Deathstroke, he shows up in a tank. If you know who Deathstroke is, you'll know why that's a bad thing. Why is Deathstroke in a tank? He's a mercenary. He's not an army character. Batman Arkham Origins actually pulled it off right to have Batman and Deathstroke actually go at each other in a one-on-one fist fight. And then Deathstroke shows up in a tank in Arkham Knight. Like, what is that? And with all this being said, just forgetting about the fact that the game just completely disregards your time just for a terrible Deathstroke fight. Just forgetting all of that, this fight is a copy-paste of another awful fight from earlier in the game. The fight from earlier in the game is an awful boss fight. You basically are in the Batmobile and are forced to do stealth in a car. And oh, you finally beat Deathstroke and this man is finally ready to come out the car. You're about to have that fight you've been waiting for. All of the terrible stuff was worth it just for this very moment. Deathstroke jumps out of his tank and gets knocked out in a single punch. In a cutscene. Wow, thanks for caring about my time, Rocksteady. This can't have been the same studio. You know, the same studio that made the amazing Mr. Freeze battle and Ra's al Ghul fight in Batman Arkham City. This can't be them. So, this next boss is kind of an outlier on the list because the boss itself isn't actually that bad. It's everything around the boss which makes it suck. This boss is called Absolute Radiance, and it's easily the hardest boss from one of the hardest games of all time, Hollow Knight. Now, like I said earlier, the boss itself isn't actually that bad. It's just, he's at the end of this thing called the Pantheon of Hollownest. The Pantheon of Hollownest is every single one of the game's bosses from start to finish, in order, and you have to beat every single one of them in one attempt. You can't die a single time. And now, at the end of the Pantheon of Hollownest, there are 3 exclusive bosses. 3 bosses which can only be fought at the very end of the Pantheon of Hollownest. But the thing is, these 3 bosses are the hardest bosses in the entire game. And beating the Pantheon of Hollownest will take about 45 minutes. So that means if you beat every single one of the bosses and then die to any of the 3 hardest bosses in the game, you have to wait almost an hour for a single rematch. And that's provided you could beat all of the other bosses first attempt every single time consistently. Now, why is Absolute Radiance on this list? Well, Absolute Radiance is the boss at the very, very end, which basically means that Absolute Radiance by itself, excluding the Pantheon of Hollownest, is the single hardest boss in the entire game. Beating the boss alone by itself can take an entire day of practicing. And you still need to fight every single one of the bosses and not die a single time just to have a single go at this guy. Another thing dragging this boss down is the fact that its attacks suck. Now, they're not as bad as some other bosses on the list, Better Chaos, but it's not very good. Basically, in Hollow Knight, if you take a hit, it depletes one of your masks that you see on the top left. It gets rid of one of those, but I think 2, maybe all 3 of the final 3 bosses in the Pantheon of Hollownest get rid of 2 masks in a single hit, which basically means you're on half health for the entire boss fight. Now, Absolute Radiance, all of its attacks are completely random, so it's pretty much impossible to dodge them, especially in the final phase. And now they all do double damage, as well as being at the end of the Pantheon of Hollownest. This is a very clear spot for the list, and I'm honestly surprised it isn't higher. If you asked me to give a reason for why this boss isn't higher up on the list, I genuinely don't have a reason. This boss is just that bad. The only thing I could possibly think of is just the fact that the other 4 are somehow even worse. Now, when I composed the list for this video, I also made myself a list of rules, and one of the rules was the game has to be good. Not this game. This is the only game out of all of them which sucks. We'll just forget about Fable 2 for the meantime, because that game, although it wasn't amazing, it didn't suck. It was just kind of meh. And, yeah, it's time we bring up a Sonic game. Now, this boss is Silver from Sonic 06. Now, let me just go into why this boss is terrible. This boss is so bad, I actually had to make an exception to the rules just to fit this boss in the list. Let's get into why this boss is bad. So first of all, it's a melee fight with someone who's just as fast as you are, right? Which might sound okay, but no. No, it isn't okay. Silver has a move where if you get within his range, which is a fairly large range, I like to point out, he completely stops you from moving. You lose your rings, he just stops you, just completely. Now, this move only works if you have rings. So if you don't have any rings in your inventory, rings are like coins in the Sonic universe, if you didn't know already. If you don't have any of those on you, he can't use that move. Sounds simple enough, but there's one massive oversight. If Silver manages to catch you at the right angle so he can hit you and make you lose your rings, but the way that he stopped you meant that you're able to immediately pick your rings back up, he can infinitely stun you. This is a boss that can combo you infinitely. And now, this isn't even mentioning the fact that Silver is just as fast, if not faster, than Sonic. He also has a much larger range, and the only way to beat this guy is by hitting him with melee attacks. I am genuinely so surprised that a game dev played this and thought this is okay to put in a video game. And you know the worst part about this? It only gets worse from here. It only gets worse. Dexodus the Invincible. The 3rd place spot on the list. Where would we be without you? Dexodus the Invincible was one of the quote-unquote invincible bosses from Borderlands 2. Every single one of the quote-unquote invincible bosses in Borderlands 2 need to have some form of grinding in order to spawn them, and they all suck. So why does Dexodus the Invincible get here? Well, for several reasons. First of all, he's one of the most expensive to spawn in, requiring a lot of a really rare resource. Secondly, there is nothing to his moves. He literally just like walks around and occasionally fires a ball and stuff. He's so boring. He also has a health bar, which is the size of a planet. It's actually insane how big this thing's health bar is. You can shoot into him for 15 minutes straight and he still won't be dead. And the worst thing of all, you went through all that trouble just to kill this guy. He doesn't even drop anything good. Now, this is the part of the list where the bosses become so ridiculously bad that I'm questioning why you would even want to fight them. 15 minutes of shooting into a massive insect is not fun. Especially considering it doesn't even give you anything good. Now, I was deciding to put another Borderlands 2 boss on here, Master Yi. Because Master Yi has far more health than Dexodus. He has shield, which basically means he has even more health. And he has really annoying poison stuff coming at you. But the thing is with Master Yi, that you can cheese him so hard. You can literally trap him underneath a gate and he dies instantly. Now, that's not a good thing. You shouldn't be able to do that with a boss. But I'd rather take the good loot immediately than have to spend 15 minutes shooting into a massive insect for ultimately nothing. This is like that Deathstroke fight on steroids. Because the Deathstroke fight, my main issue with it is the fact that it had no regard for the player's time at all. This fight is even worse, because at least the Deathstroke fight was actually like a somewhat interesting boss fight. Not Dexodus, it's just a massive insect that you shoot into. Thank you for making me have to edit down 45 minutes of footage, Final Fantasy 15. The next boss is Adamantoise from Final Fantasy 15. He is one of the many random hunts that you can go on. The thing is, Adamantoise is the hunt with the most amount of health. By miles. I mean, he's a freaking turtle mountain. I mean, of course he's going to have the most health. Thing is, I've played Final Fantasy 15. I haven't fought Adamantoise because I don't really want to. But I've realised that all of the hunt bosses usually take ages in themselves. And this is the one with the most health. By miles. This boss has so much health that the shortest video I could get of him was 45 minutes long. It's just warp striking directly into him over and over and over again for 45 minutes. The worst part is it doesn't fight back. It just sits there while you warp strike directly into its face for 45 minutes over and over again. It isn't even a challenge. The only way you can actually die in this fight is if you're using a royal arm weapon, which kills you as you use it. The idea of the mountain turtle boss isn't that bad because its character design is quite good. But the thing is, this is a 45-minute long boss fight and it's still somehow the second easiest on the list after Lucia. And if you don't believe me when I say this boss is boring, watch a video of someone killing it from start to finish. Do it, I dare you. And somehow, someone managed to make a boss worse than this. Someone messed up so bad that this is the second place. There's a boss worse than this. Let's take a little bit of a breather, and before we get into the number one spot, let's just look at a few honourable mentions that didn't quite make the final cut of the list. The first honourable mention is Augustine from Infamous Second Son. This is basically a boss where they made you go through an entire game learning the powers that you have, and then in order to beat the final boss, you have to immediately learn a brand new power that you've never used before. Oh wow, great, I'm sure that would work well. Next is Flame Hyanard. His attacks aren't that bad. He's not even a bad boss. Flame Hyanard, in terms of this list and the honourable mentions, is the best boss by miles. The reason he enters the honourable mentions list is because PS2 audio mixing. It's pretty hard to hear, but if you listen closely, you'll be able to hear Flame Hyanard say burn! Next is another boss I've actually fought, and it's Shao Kahn from Mortal Kombat 9. Basically, this guy has super armor and he can kill you in 2 hits in a fighting game. And the way you beat him is literally to just duck under all of his moves, and when he's vulnerable, just uppercut him. do this for 5 minutes and you win the fight. It's terrible. The next is Blade Bearer and Cannoneer from Code Vein. Now, they're like Ornstein and Smaug from Dark Souls 1, except the fat guy doesn't move at all, so they can't block the speedy guy. And the fat guy is also a ranged attacker with a move that hits underneath you. That's not even mentioning the fact that they do far more damage than Ornstein and Smaug. It's basically just Ornstein and Smaug without the balancing. It's probably the worst way to pull off a gank fight ever. Well, without any further ado, let's get into it. The worst boss of all time. The number 1 spot is this boss called the Wraith from a game called Evolve. It's the boss that I myself have had the pleasure of fighting. Now, for those of you who don't remember Evolve, it's kind of like the opposite of Dead by Daylight. You have 4 hunters that are controlled by players, and you also have a monster which is also controlled by a player. But the reason it's the opposite of Dead by Daylight is that the players hunt the monster rather than the monster hunting the players. Pretty interesting, right? This game actually did quite well. It managed to sell 3 million copies, which is 3 times what Undertale has done. And Undertale is one of the most popular indie games of all time. How come no one remembers Evolve? Well, the maps were too big. Because the hunters needed to find the monster, and the monster leveled up by preying on the wildlife, the map needed to be fairly large. But the map was so large that it would take the hunters about an hour to find the monster, and by that point the monster had already killed so much wildlife that it was able to take on all 4 hunters at the same time and win easily. So, here comes the Wraith. The Wraith was a boss designed on stealth. Now, with that previous issue I just mentioned, you would know why that's a really terrible thing. It meant games are really drawn out. But no, that actually wasn't the issue at all. The issue was the balancing. The Wraith had the least health and armor of every boss in the game, so the devs thought it was a good idea to give it a move called Supernova. Now, Supernova gave the Wraith a moderate attack increase, which is fine, but it also gave it 1000% attack speed increase. That's 10 times. For every 1 attack it did before, it now does 10 with the extra damage. I know what you're thinking, that's crazy, that should have been laughed at immediately. Oh, well, it only gets worse. The Wraith also had a move called Decoy, which is basically where the Wraith makes a clone of itself. But the Wraith also goes invisible, and it can still attack the hunters while it's invisible, and so can the clone. And the clone is affected by Supernova. In a game where the entire point is it's 4v1, you can make it 2 versus 4. Both the Wraith and the clone individually can take out all 4 hunters by themselves before they even get off the launch pad. Somehow, it gets even worse. The Wraith had a move called Warp Strike, where it'll basically immediately teleport to the hunters, and when it hits them, it will just explode, dealing massive damage. Now, because the Wraith was designed for stealth, getting up to max level before the hunters found you was child's play. All you needed to do was cast Warp Blast, cast Supernova, cast Decoy, and go! You win! You can't trust gamers with this kind of power. You just don't. It's an awful idea. The game lost 95% of its player base in the first month. It then went free to play a year later, and then they had to shut it down because it wasn't worth the server cost. Now, I don't think this was entirely the Wraith's fault. Like I said, the gameplay loop was boring and like more in the monster's favor than the hunters. But I do think the Wraith was the final straw that made people go, nah, I'm quitting this game. Imagine all the games that could have been made, like if Evolve were to succeed. This boss is so bad that it's actually funny. It's not like Adamantoise, where it's just kind of like, why? This is just funny that someone would think that this is a good idea. So, Wraith, for single-handedly killing off an entire subgenre, you easily get the number 1 spot. So, to end this video, I thought I'd make a quick rundown of all the bosses. Number 10 was all of them from Deus Ex Human Revolution. Number 9 was Lucian from Fable 2. Number 8 was Marauder Shields from Mass Effect 3. Number 7 was Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1. Number 6 was Deathstroke from Batman Arkham Knight. Number 5 was Absolute Radiance from Hollow Knight. Number 4 was Silver from Sonic 06. Number 3 was Dexodus the Invincible from Borderlands 2. Number 2 was Adamantoise from Final Fantasy 15. And number 1 was The Wraith from Evolve. Now, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. And this will be the first video that I'm posting onto the UniCV channel. So I hope this does alright. And now all that's done, see ya, I guess.